In 1968, a Phillips 66 mechanic named Wendell worked a 3-bay station outside Macon, Georgia. A widow came in every fall, afraid this would be the winter her Buick stranded her. Wendell never charged more than $1. Each October he pulled the cables, wire-brushed the posts bright, and pressed a fingerful of petroleum jelly over the bare lead and over a dozen connections she never saw. That Buick fired on the first cold morning for 9 straight years. The same no start today leaves a dealership with a $600 charging system bill. What Wendell smeared on those posts is number 1 on this list. We did not lose this knowledge because cars got better. We lost it when the full service station closed. The man who pumped your gas also lifted your hood, and under his bench sat a jar of petroleum jelly that solved 30 problems no warning light has ever caught. 15 cents. He learned where it belonged by feel, his hands black to the wrist. We traded him for a sealed module, a $400 scan tool, and a service door we cannot walk through. The jar is still on the drugstore shelf. The hands that knew its uses are nearly all in the ground. Number 17 is a fingerful of jelly on a trailer hitch and plug, and it stops a wiring failure a shop now traces at $200 an hour. Number 12 held a fresh bearing during an assembly so delicate that one dropped roller meant tearing the whole job back down, and it cost less than a penny. And number 3, the spring ritual every station performed on a part the dealer has since sealed shut, is gone from the trade school manuals because the corrosion it prevented is now the most profitable no start in any modern bay. These 25 tricks were not about saving money. They were about a man who refused to let small things become large ones, with a 15-cent jar and the knowledge of where it belonged. Not maintenance. Foresight. He saw a failure coming and stopped it with his thumb, weeks before the part announced itself. That attention has been replaced by a light that only speaks after the damage is done. Hit that subscribe button, and let us count down the 25 forgotten garage tricks 1968 service station mechanics used Vaseline for, the ones that saved their customers thousands. Number 25. Greasing the speedometer cable. A cure for a noise the dealer now calls a whole new cluster. You drew the cable out, wiped the dried grease off the steel core, and pulled it through a glob of petroleum jelly. The bouncing needle settled. The whine behind the dash went silent. A Sinclair attendant in 1966 cured a salesman's jumping speedometer this way while the tank filled. The man drove another decade on that cable. Every speedometer from General Motors, Ford, and Mopar ran on a greased cable until electronic clusters arrived in the mid-1980s. It was not a broken gauge. It was a dry wire gone thirsty. Number 24, mounting a tire bead with a film of jelly. The difference between a clean seat and a fight. You ran a thin smear around both beads before working the tire on. The rubber slid over the lip and the bead popped home with a clean crack of air. A station man in 1967 mounted bias ply tires all day with a coffee can of jelly at his feet and never tore a bead. This was standard before mounting machines took the work in the 1970s. It was not muscle that seated the tire. It was the slick that let the rubber move. Number 23. The film on every hinge, latch, and striker. The quiet that told you a door was cared for. You worked a DAB into each hinge pin, the hood latch, and the trunk striker. The squeak died. The latch caught soft instead of slamming. A Gulf attendant in 1968 did this on every car. A dry hinge today is a sagging door tomorrow. Detroit's assembly lines coated these points with a grease no owner was told to renew. It was not a squeak he silenced. It was 10 years of wear he kept from starting. Number 22, coating the antenna mast. A 2-second fix for a part that froze solid by spring. You wiped the mast, ran a film of jelly down its length, and worked it up and down. The sections moved free, and road grime no longer welded them shut. A man in 1969 kept his power antenna alive for the life of the car, while his neighbors seized and stripped its motor by the third winter. Power masts on the big sedans were bare metal sliding in bare metal, built to be wiped and greased. It was not a luxury he protected. It was a part the factory meant to be touched. Number 21, greasing the choke and throttle linkage. A smear that cured a cold morning stumble. You wiped the pivots on the choke and throttle linkage and worked a little jelly into each joint. The cold, fast idle stepped down smooth, and the engine pulled away clean. A station mechanic in 1968 cured a hard-starting Ford this way, after another shop had blamed a $100 carburetor rebuild. Every Rochester, Holly, and Carter carburetor leaned on these tiny pivots until the feedback carburetor sealed them away in 1981. It was not the carburetor that was tired, it was a dry hinge the size of a matchstick. Number 20, the jelly on the wiper pivots and blade. A clear windshield bought for nothing. You worked a film into the wiper pivots so the arms swept without chatter, and wiped a trace along the blade to keep it supple. A Texaco man in 1967 did this each spring for the school bus drivers. A chattering wiper in a storm is a blind driver. Wiper linkages of the period ran on exposed pivots that dried and bound without a yearly touch. It was not a wiper he serviced. It was the one thing between a driver and a blind windshield. Number 19, coating the chrome against winter salt. A film between bright metal and rot. You wiped the bumpers dry and rubbed a thin layer of jelly over the chrome before the first snow. Road salt beaded and rolled instead of biting the plating. A station owner in 1968 sent his northern customers home this way every November. Their bumpers shone while their neighbors bubbled by March. Chrome of that era was thin plating over pot metal and steel, and salt found every pinhole. It was not vanity, it was a barrier, one fingertip thick against a winter that ate cars alive. Number 18, the film on tools and the bench vise. A mechanic protected his own steel. At day's end, you wiped a trace over the vise jaws and your good wrenches. By morning, there was no orange bloom of flash rust on the bare metal. A garage man in 1965 kept his father's tools bright this way for 40 years and passed them down without a speck of pitting. Hand tools of the time were plain carbon steel that rusted overnight in an unheated bay. It was not the tool he saved, it was the inheritance. Number 17, the dab on the hitchball and trailer plug. A fingerful that saved a wiring nightmare. You smeared jelly over the hitchball so the coupler turned silent and worked a film into the 7-pin plug to keep the contacts bright. A station mechanic in 1968 set up a farmer's trailer this way before harvest. The lights held all season. Trailer plugs of the era were open brass pins that corroded green in a single wet month. It was not the trailer he protected. It was every connection the road tried to corrode shut. Here is something nobody is counting. The men who ran those service stations, who knew without thinking where a fingerful of jelly belonged, are nearly all gone. They came up before the sealed module, before the throwaway part. The youngest are past 80. They did not keep this knowledge in a book. They kept it in their hands, in 30,000 hours of lifting hoods and touching the parts that failed. When they die, the jar stays on the drugstore shelf 15 cents. exactly where it always was. But the knowing goes into the ground with them. Picture a man who can glance down a wet row of cars and name the one that will not start tomorrow by the green crust on its posts. He fixes it with his thumb before it happens. That cannot be downloaded. The chain ran from one station bay to the next apprentice for 50 years. Then the stations closed. We are writing it down before the last of these men are buried. Number 16, easing rubber through a panel. The difference between a clean install and a torn grommet. You smeared jelly on the grommet and the lip of the hole, then worked the rubber through. It slid into place instead of folding or tearing. A station mechanic in 1967 fed a wiring grommet through a firewall this way without nicking a wire. A job ruined the moment the rubber pinches. Every rubber pass-through on a car of the era was installed dry by the impatient and torn in the trying. It was not strength that seated the rubber. It was the slick that let it pass. Number 15, a film on the hose ends before they go on. A clean seal and an easy job next time. You ran a thin smear inside the hose end before pushing it onto the radiator neck. It slid home full, sealed under the clamp, and pulled off easily next time. A station man in 1968 hosed a cooling system this way, so the next mechanic never cut a welded-on hose loose. Radiator and heater necks of the era were bare brass and steel that rubber bonded to over the years. It was not the clamp that made the seal. It was the rubber seated full and true. Number 14, the smear on a vacuum line and its fitting. A sealed connection and no chasing leaks. You wiped a trace on the hose before pressing it onto its brass nipple. The hose seated full, sealed without a hiss, and a hairline leak never had a place to start. A tune-up man in 1968 ran every line this way. One leaking hose threw off a handset carburetor and left the engine rough. The emissions rules after 1968 multiplied the vacuum hoses, and every dry fitting was a new place to leak. It was not the carburetor. It was a 1/4 inch of hose that never sealed. Number 13, the film on the oil filter gasket. A trick that stopped a leak and a stuck filter both. You ran a jelly-wet finger around the gasket of the new filter before spinning it on. It seated without dragging, sealed clean, and came loose by hand next time instead of welding to the engine block. A fleet mechanic in 1968 filtered a yard of trucks this way. Not one wept a drop or fought the wrench later. Spin-on filters, standard since the late 1950s, sealed on a bare rubber ring that bonded to dry metal. It was not the filter that leaked. It was a gasket gone on dry and angry. Number 12, holding a part in place during assembly. A trick that turned 3 hands into 2. You packed a thrust washer or a loose needle bearing into its bore with a dab of jelly, and it stayed put while you closed the case. The jelly held it exactly, then dissolved the moment warm oil reached it. A transmission rebuilder in 1966 set 30 needle rollers this way, a job that meant tearing the case down if one dropped. It was standard in every gearbox and water pump build of the era, where jelly was the assembly aid of choice. It was not glue. It was a held breath that melted when the oil came up. Number 11, the film on the brake and clutch boots. Suppleness kept in the rubber that guards the cylinder. You worked a trace over the outside of the boots at the master cylinder and clutch push rod, the exposed rubber only. Never the fluid side. They stayed soft and kept grit out of the bore. A station mechanic in 1968 dressed these every spring. A cracked boot let in the dirt that scored a cylinder and softened the pedal. The dual-circuit master cylinder, federal law since 1967, doubled the boot's worth saving. It was not the cylinder that failed. It was the dry rubber that let the road in. Number 10. Dressing the rubber mounts and bushings. A film that bought years of quiet. You wiped a thin layer over the exposed rubber of the motor mounts, sway bar bushings, and body mounts. The rubber stayed pliable instead of cracking into a clunk. A station man in 1967 dressed a delivery van's mounts twice a year. They outlasted 2 sets on the trucks that ran dry. Natural rubber mounts of the era hardened and split under heat and ozone without a barrier. It was not the engine that began to shake. It was the rubber under it giving up. Number 9. Jelly on threads going into aluminum. A film that kept 2 metals from welding shut. You wiped a light coat on a steel bolt before running it into aluminum, a water pump bolt, a thermostat stud, a sender. Months later, it backed out clean instead of seizing the soft threads. A station mechanic in 1968 saved a Buick's aluminum intake this way. Threads a careless wrench would have torn, and an engine's worth of trouble. Steel left dry and aluminum fuses through corrosion until the threads tear on removal. It was not the bolt that ruined the part. It was the dry steel grown into the soft metal. There is a reason no one teaches you the 15-cent fix anymore. In 2021, the Right to Repair movement won a partial victory in Massachusetts, forcing automakers to share diagnostic data with independent shops. The industry spent over $25 million fighting it, and fights it still. The reason is the math. The dealership service network in this country earns well over $100 billion a year, and that number depends on you not knowing what is wrong with your car. A driver who stopped corrosion with his thumb did not need a $600 diagnosis. A man who dressed his own rubber did not need a $400 mount job. Every trick here made a customer harder to sell to. A jar of petroleum jelly was worth more than any extended warranty, and that is exactly why no one points you toward the drugstore shelf. The craft was not lost. It was made unprofitable, then allowed to die. Number 8. A trace on the distributor cam. The smallest dab in the whole tune-up, and one of the most important. You lifted the rotor, found the felt wiper and cam lobes, and touched the lightest film of jelly there. That trace fed the rubbing block so the points wore slow, and the dwell held for thousands of miles. A tune-up man in 1968 never closed a cap without it. A dry cam ground the points open and let the engine drift out of time. Breaker point ignition ran on this tiny contact until GM's electronic HEI spread after 1974. It was not the points that burned early. It was a dry cam no one thought to touch. Number 7. The film on the radiator cap seal. A few cents that held the pressure in. You wiped a trace on the cap gasket before setting it back on the neck. The seal, seated soft and full, held its rated pressure and lifted off later without tearing. A station attendant in 1968 dressed every cap he touched. A cap down a single pound of pressure boils a cooling system that was otherwise fine. Pressure caps of the era sealed on a rubber ring that hardened and shrank within 2 seasons. It was not the radiator that boiled over. It was a tired seal that stopped holding the pressure. Number 6. Jelly inside the plug wire and distributor boots. The fix for a no start in the rain. You worked a film inside each spark plug boot and around the cap towers. They sealed out moisture, and the engine fired on wet mornings that left its neighbors cranking. A Phillips 66 man in 1968 dressed every boot before fall. A damp ignition will not start in the one storm you cannot wait out. Rubber boots of the era cracked, and let moisture bridge the spark to ground. It was not the ignition that died in the rain. It was a dry boot that let the water in. Number 5, dressing the door and window weather strip. A film that stopped leaks, wind, and a frozen door. You wiped a thin layer along the weather strip at the doors, windows, and trunk. The rubber stayed soft, sealed out water and wind, and never froze the door shut in January. A station man in 1968 dressed a night shift nurse's weather strip each fall so her door opened on the coldest mornings. Sponge rubber seals of the era dried, shrank, and cracked within a few years if left bare. It was not the door that stuck. It was the rubber that had forgotten how to give. Number 4, the film on the ground strap and cable lugs. The cure for 100 gremlins at once. You cleaned the engine to body ground strap and cable ends to bright metal, then covered each with jelly. The dim lights, the slow crank, the flickering gauges, a dozen ghosts from one corroded ground. A station mechanic in 1968 chased a Chevy's wandering faults to a green ground strap. 5 minutes, no charge. Bolt-on grounds of the era corroded under the hood until resistance starved the whole electrical system. It was not the wiring that was haunted, it was one dirty connection no one had cleaned. Number 3, coating the battery tray and hold down. A film that stopped the acid before it ate the car. You wiped jelly over the tray, the hold-down clamp, and the bolts that fought acid fumes daily. The white crust never formed, the tray never rusted through, the clamp never seized. A Gulf attendant in 1968 coated every tray he serviced. Acid, left to work, eats through the tray and into the fender. Vented batteries of the era breathed acid mist until maintenance-free sealed designs spread through the 1970s. It was not the battery that rotted the car. It was the acid no one had sealed away. Number 2, the trace in every bulb, socket, and fuse clip. 2 minutes that kept every light alive. You pulled the tail light and turn signal bulbs, touched a film into each socket, and did the same at the fuse clips. The lights stopped flickering, and the contacts never went green. A station man in 1968 did this before inspection season. A dead tail light is a ticket, or worse, on a dark road. Bayonet bulbs of the era sat in bare brass sockets that corroded in the damp. It was not the bulb that burned out. It was the socket that quietly let it go. Number 1, a dab of petroleum jelly on the battery terminals. That is all. Once a year, on 2 posts. You wire brushed the posts and clamps bright, bolted them down tight, and pressed a fingerful of jelly over each. The green crust never returned. The crank stayed strong through the coldest mornings. The slow starve of a corroded connection never began. Your grandfather did this every spring without calling it anything. He called it keeping after it. 2 minutes a year for 50 years, and he never once stood over a dead battery wondering why a car that ran fine yesterday would not turn over. The corroded terminal was the most common no-start in America and the cheapest thing on earth to prevent. Number 1 is not a trick. It is the 2 minutes that stops the failure underneath every other failure on this list. None of these tricks required a certification, no scan tool, no subscription to a manufacturer's database. They required a 15-cent jar and a man who knew where to put it, and the belief that he could stop a failure with his own hands before it began. That belief was the default setting of every service station in America. Not confidence born from training, confidence born from intimacy. Enough hours under enough hoods to see the rust before it spread and the crack before it split. It kept ordinary cars and their engines running for years on parts the dealer now replaces by the armful. We did not lose the jar. It is still on the drugstore shelf, 15 cents, exactly where it always was. We lost the hands that knew its uses. We lost the man in the gray uniform who coated your battery posts without being asked, who dressed your weather strip so your door would open in January, who once rubbed a film into a frozen latch and said, "There, that is all it ever needed." He is gone now, and most of what he knew went into the ground with him. The dealership charges $600 for the no start he prevented with his thumb and calls it progress. But not all of it is lost. Some of it is in this video, written down at last, before the last of those men were buried. The next time your car gives you trouble you cannot name, do not reach for the phone. Reach for the jar on the shelf. The craft is not dead. It is 15 cents and a willing hand away.